Hi and welcome back. Today we're doing a very quick video, well, quickish, 10 minutes or so, on New York City versus London. Now, obviously, I know a little bit about London, and New York is sort of a place that we see in the likes of Friends and whatnot, and that's about it, really, isn't it?
Well, Sex and the City, that there.
Right, I don't know. You watch.
Well, it's not going anymore, is it? But I'm sure that's in the Big Apple.
Yeah, quite possibly. But let's have a go and see what we come up with then.
According to Travel and Leisure magazine, the best city in the world right now you could visit is San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, followed by Charleston in the USA, followed by Chiang Mai in Thailand. These three
I know of Charleston, and thinking about it, I've heard of Chiang Mai only because of the fact that I used to be a travel agent, and one of the destinations in China was Chiang Mai because they've got fantastic beaches.
It's not in China, it's in Thailand.
Oh well, that shows you how much I knew. Oh well.
Are you doing it again now?
No, I couldn't.
Three places, however, don't even get on the top 20 places to actually live in this year's Quality of Living Index, a yearly list compiled by HR firm Mercer. Apparently, if you want to live the good life, you should move to Vienna, Austria, Zurich, Switzerland.
Well, I was going to crack a joke about Vienna.
Till he realised he's getting it mixed up with Venice. I was going to say Vienna was sinking slowly.
Thanks. Bye.
Switzerland, or Auckland, New Zealand. The top 20 list doesn't include any cities from the UK or the USA, two countries that have arguably been the two heavyweights in the.
Well, they've obviously got the list wrong if it's not including the UK. Okay, and USA as well.
Last century regarding power and wealth. These two countries, however, contain cities that attract millions of overseas visitors every year. Today, we are going to compare them in this episode of the infographic show, New York City versus London. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad.
You can do that with us as well, you know. You don't have to just do it to them. I mean, I know infographics are brilliant and everything like that, but we like them as well. So you can subscribe to us.
Cities are two of the most visited places in the entire world. In 2016, though, the most visited city in the world by international travelers was Thailand's capital, Bangkok. 21.47 million people visited Bangkok that year. In second place was London with 19.88 million visitors, and in third place was Paris with 18.03 million visitors. The most visited US city was New York City, and that was in fifth place with 12.75 million visitors. Dubai.
So London has a lot more visitors.
Yeah, that's surprising
a lot more.
Me, actually.
I would have thought with New York, just purely with people in America, I'd have thought you'd have been going over there visiting New York and things like that, but obviously wrong.
Dubai was in fourth. In the last 5 years, Bangkok held the first position 3 times and London twice. In our comparison, we might thereby deduce that London is more visitable than New York City. Let's find out why. First, we will take a look at the two cities' abridged history. We'll start with London as it's the elder. The city of London is old, but nowhere near as old as some cities in the Middle East, China, or other parts of Europe. You'll know from our show on the British and Roman empires that Britain was invaded by the Romans in 43 AD. They established the city of Londinium that at the time was about the size of a small village in England right now. When the Romans left Londinium, it was pretty much a ghost town, and for hundreds of years it remained so. Even the invading Vikings didn't do much with it, and it wasn't until the Normans invaded from France and subjugated the country that London became a powerful city. William the Conqueror made London the Norman stronghold, building the famous Tower of London. The Normans would be the last people to this day to successfully invade England. In medieval times, London grew in power and wealth, but that also included the spread of poverty, corruption, and greed among the upper echelons of society and bouts of power.
I'd like to point out here something really important. None of that depravity and theft and everything like that and greed that went on came in our pockets. No, they never gave us any. Mind you, we're in Yorkshire, so we're where the real people are, further up.
Oh my God.
Population denuding plagues. It wasn't until 1850 that London became the largest city in the world in terms of population. Some sources say it was as early as 1825, though most scholars agree that London was the most populated city until the 1920s. Another city then took over right up until the 60s, and that was the city of New York. Long before New York City had high-rise buildings, it was the stomping ground of Algonquin natives who hunted and fished where people now trade stocks and eat pastrami sandwiches. It wasn't until 1624 that European settlers would start a community community in the city when families of the Dutch West India Company made a home of Nutten Island. That's
Now, what he's just said there is that the Native Americans lived there in that area. They didn't call it New York. So how can he say that the people who went over in 1624 moved into the city? I'm sure he just said that they moved into the city. Let's just go back a little bit.
until 1624 that European settlers would start a community in the city when families of the Dutch
Yeah, community in the city. It wasn't a city. It was a place where Native Americans lived. Not a city. London was, but it wasn't. But anyway.
West India Company made a home of Nutten Island. That's now known as Governor's Island and is between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Being Dutch, they called this place New Amsterdam. Some historians say that the Dutch bought the area from the natives for a few trinkets. The peace between the natives and the Euro expansionists didn't last, and the trouble ended with a lot more native casualties than Dutch casualties. New Amsterdam soon covered much of what we regard as New York City today, but the imperialistic Brits, guided by London prospectors, would soon burst the Dutch bubble. On August 26, 1664, 4 British frigates sailed to New Amsterdam and in a bloodless coup took control and renamed it New York after the Duke of York, not the city of York, in the north of England. At that time, the city had about 1,500 Europeans and 375 Africans, most of whom were slaves. It remained that way for over 100 years, and even when American independence was on the cards, New York...
Right, to put that into context, we live in a place in North Yorkshire which it's officially called a city, but only because of something that went on in history.
The cathedral.
Yeah, and the fact it's got a cathedral. But it's the size of what we'd class as a town. We've got over 20,000 people living here. So 1,800 would be a village, not a city, wouldn't it? We'd class it as a very, very small village.
Yeah.
You're talking not many houses at all. So the fact that 4 ships went over and took it over, that doesn't surprise me. It's not like going into New York now with 4 ships and saying, right, we're having this, is it?
No.
City was a stronghold for British loyalists. In 1783, the British were forced out, and in 1789, it became the first national capital of the US. Only in 1790 did the capital become Washington, D.C. Like London, the growing city had its fair share of growing pains, including great fires and huge loss of life due to yellow fever and cholera. Nonetheless, by 1850, the population was more than...
Now, we all know about the Great Fire of London. But to be honest, I've never heard of a Great Fire of New York, and it's just mentioned it there.
Yeah.
Yellow fever, I've sort of heard about it, but it's not been something that really... To be honest, I thought it was something more to do with miners in gold rush times and things like that. I'm sure I've probably heard it on Westerns or something like that, but I never equated yellow fever or major fires to likes of New York, so that's something I didn't know at all.
550,000, and New York City had become a center of the world. So now we come to the present day. The population of London right now is thought to be about 8.7 million. This has spiked lately due to the arrival of ethnic minorities that make up about 44% of the city's population. London covers an area of 607 square miles, making it the biggest city in Europe. New York City has a population of 8.538 million, and it is mixed in terms of ethnicity. About 44% of residents are white Caucasian, 27% Hispanic, 25% Black or African American, with a much smaller mix of other ethnicities. The city covers 304 square miles and is the biggest city in the USA, though considerably smaller than London, but with almost equal population.
That's really shocked me, that.
Well, all I can think of is that in London, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been there or not, but yes, there are skyscrapers, but there aren't millions of skyscrapers. No. And all I'm thinking of, because you've got similar sort of amounts of population, but and about half the landmass, that most people in New York must live in high-rise skyscrapers or something like that, or there must be more that do, because I personally always think of Americans of having bigger houses because of the fact that there's more land to have the houses on, whereas in the UK it tends to be much smaller houses.
Right, shoe boxes.
Yeah, but in London, you can go in there and yes, there are skyscrapers, but they tend to be more office blocks than for accommodation.
Yeah, but then
there are some.
Really, that big? What?
Yeah,
How many floors?
20 floors for a housing one. would seem a very high one. You know, that would seem very high, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Let us know in the comments. See how high are the higher accommodation skyscrapers in New York? Because to be honest, that I thought that possibly they were about the same size population-wise, but
I didn't. I actually thought there would be a lot more in New York.
Did you? Yeah.
And that it would be much, much bigger than... That's really surprised me, that the size of London to...
Yeah. Let's see what else he has to say.
Populations, this means New Yorkers have far less space. So what about the standard of living in these cities? They are both pivotal cities regarding the financial sector, though one website claims that London's financial sector is slightly bigger with 340,000 employees to New York's 322,000. As of March 2017, the Global Financial Centers Index puts London at the center of the world, with New York hot on its heels in the number 2 spot. New York has more billionaires.
Right, just something on the financial sector, which may or may not be something we'll cover later on. Since Brexit, officially we're still the number 1 centre in Europe, but a lot of the countries are trying to pull companies away from the UK. So that might change, but not significantly, purely because it's so established. It's like France, Germany, etc. They're trying to build up their equivalent to our financial areas. I know for a fact they're struggling because they haven't got the infrastructure there. All the businesses are work through there. So I could see where New York and London could become very, very equal, or maybe just the other way around, but not to any major amount. So I think that might change.
With 103 in 2017 according to Forbes, while London only has 72. London is said to have better job growth though over the last decade. For the average Joe among us, how is life in these cities? Again, it depends on...
I'm going to have to go back on that. Is that how Americans spell billionaires? Because that looks...
I've never noticed that. It's not right. It's got an I in.
And it's got more than one L. Got 2 L's.
No, I think he's maybe typed it wrong. I don't.
I mean, it could be because we do have different ways of spelling things. So that stuck out to me. That anyway.
London is said to have better job growth though over the last decade. For the average Joe among us, how is life in these cities? Again, it depends on which source you read. The latest cost of living index by Expatizen puts New York as the 5th most expensive city to live in the world, and London in 12th, with food and housing in New York being more expensive, but clothes and transportation being cheaper. The Guardian reports that after Brexit, London got a lot cheaper, stating that the city has recently arrived at a newfound bargain basement status. In fact, according to the website Numbeo, that compares cost of prices around the world, the cities are fairly equal in terms of eating, going out, shopping, but just a bit more in New York. Renting in London is cheaper than New York if you're not renting high-end apartments, but actually buying a place is much more expensive in London on average. Travel is more expensive in London, whether you buy your own gas or use public transportation. Gas and electric is also more expensive in London, but internet is almost half the price of New York on average. Education...
Yeah, I've heard that before, that we're a lot cheaper on internet because the infrastructure was almost there to begin with when the internet started, and as you probably know now, the World Wide Web was actually a British invention. The technical side of it was created by the American government for spying, and then it became available to everybody, and then what used to be called British Telecom, BT, they built in what was now known as the World Wide Web. But with regard to fuel costs and everything, I think this might be a little bit out of date because of the fact of what's happened with Russia recently. The fuel costs have just gone up and up and up and up. It might be the same in America, I don't know. But I know that there was a short period where I was delivering for a well-known company beginning with an A and ending in Zon. And it was one of these situations where I rented a van, I delivered on behalf of the company and had to pay my own costs and everything. And the fuel costs were just going up so quickly, you'd go one day and it'd be 10p dearer the next day. But anyway.
Is more expensive in New York, and it's thought that inner city London schools are a bit better than inner city New York schools. The average wage in New York is $4,542 a month, while in London it is only $2,952 a month. That might sound bad for Londoners, but they do get free healthcare, lots of paid vacation, and in general, better workers' rights. Money aside, what about the general day-to-day creature comforts? Well, as London is much bigger, it also has more space. With that, you get more parks and more green spaces. At the same time, New York is easier to get around, and some people speaking on forums say a bit more fun, as it's compact and unlike London is more of a 24-hour city. If you are out at night, London may have more crimes in terms of robberies and assaults, but New York has more murders. According to Numbeo, respondents to a survey said they felt similar about safety in London and New York. It seems the difference is bigger crimes are more common in New York, but your chances of finding trouble on the street is more likely in London. We should, however, take this to those that have lived in both cities. According to one American man who did both for many years, he said on a forum thread that both cities were too expensive even when single. He loved the open, sprawling green spaces in London and at times didn't like the noisy, claustrophobic streets of New York. He did, however, like the fact that in New York you could sit down anywhere and find enjoyment, while London was too spread out for him at times. The writer agreed with the sites we cited already on costs of things, also the heavy workload in the US for most people, but did say in terms of meeting new people, socializing, or partying, New York is easier. One more thing he pointed out that we didn't mention yet was the weather, which is a deal breaker for some people. New York has colder winters and can have steaming hot summers, whereas London is cool, damp, and gray for much of the year, with some warm weeks in summer and only a moderately cold winter compared to New York. We'll end it there with the weather. Have you lived in or...
Right. Okay, so there was quite a few things there that I didn't realise. The thing about the fire of... One thing we're taught at schools, and I'm sure maybe in New York you're taught it for New York, is the Great Fire of London. But I never knew that there was fires that went down in New York, because that's obviously recent history, whereas the Great Fire of London is hundreds of years ago, and that happened because literally the houses, you could lean out of the first floor, or as you'd call it, the second floor. You can lean out of the window and touch the opposite side. They were built that close together because there wasn't cars, there was horses and some streets, but other streets you just walk down yourself. If you ever go to York, and I would strongly suggest it, there's a place called the Shambles, which is built from that period, and it's not been altered. And literally there's some houses that you can see, you could lean out and touch the neighbour's window that's across the street from you. That's how close it is on the first, American way to say it is the second floor, but we'd call it the first floor. We have the ground floor, first floor, you have the first floor, second floor. So, right. So that would certainly be one thing that I didn't know. Yellow fever, I seem to think about it as Western things, as in the fact of cowboys and gold hunting and things like that. But it's maybe it was happening at that time, and I've noticed it in films to do with that. But I think they're very, very similar in a lot of ways, aren't they?
I'm just so shocked at the population.
Yeah. Right, well, I hope you liked this video, and please do have a look at some of the others that will come in on at the end of this video. Speak to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.